Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 453. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Before we get into everything today, I just want to remind people that we are hosting our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute, so please head on over. Your donation is tax deductible, so write it off on your taxes. Give the money to us rather than giving it to the government, and help us keep doing what we are doing, making great content for the libertarian movement, whether that's writing books. The Institute has put out 9 so far. Articles, we have new op-eds and news articles every day on the website. Podcasts, including the Scott Horton Show, this show, Don't Tread on Anyone. So just tons of great stuff that we're doing at the Institute. Help us to keep doing it. Head on over and make a donation today. And with that, let's get into the episode. First story we have today is Senate passes its version of the NDAA. And the Senate on Thursday night passed its version of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, and this is the annual Pentagon funding bill. The bill passed on a vote of 86 to 11. The debt ceiling deal reached between House Republicans and the White House set the NDAA at $886 billion, which is the amount President Biden requested. House and Congress are planning to increase that figure by even more by passing emergency supplemental funding, which is not limited by the debt ceiling deal. And so typically every year, the NDAA gives stuffed with, I would say, between like 15 and probably $40 billion in additional spending after the president has put forward their version of the spending bill. This year, that could not happen because of the debt ceiling deal. And so the plan this year is to pass the 886, but then to add in $10 billion here for Ukraine, $20 billion here for this or that, or, whatever they decide, or whatever they, work everybody into hysteria about it and get, get funding for is going to happen throughout the year rather than in the NDAA this time. So the Senate amendments to the NDAA that would have increased oversight for the weapons sent to Ukraine were rejected. An amendment introduced by Senator Rand Paul, he's a Republican from Kentucky, to require audits and investigations of Ukraine aid failed on a vote of 20-78, with only Republicans supporting the measure. The Senate also rejected an amendment to establish a lead inspector general for Ukraine aid with a vote of 51-48, and it required 60 votes, not just the majority threshold. The House passed its version of the spending bill earlier this month, so the next step is for the two chambers to get together and negotiate the finalized version that will head to President Biden's desk. The House version is also worth $886 billion, but the chambers may clash over the spending as the House Republicans' amendment reacted to social policies within the military. And so, unfortunately, this year, the conversation around the NDAA wasn't around, are we going to put a new war powers resolution in for Syria or Yemen or something like that. The Republicans are really concerned about what the Democrats were doing as far as abortion and other social measures for the military. And you could certainly feel like those are important. However, it just doesn't seem as important as what the military actually does, which is fight wars. And that was almost a no debate at all in this $886 billion defense spending budget. All right, next up here, article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute last week. Representative Jim Jordan, smoking gun proof of White House pressured Facebook to censor Americans. And this is a Twitter thread that Representative Jim Jordan published, and it contains internal Facebook discussions exposing how the company bent to pressure from the White House and censored Americans. In the documents, the Joe Biden administration is shown pressuring Facebook to censor a popular television news host and remove a meme. In a thread published on Twitter, Jordan released a series of documents concerning pressure Facebook was receiving from the White House and the company's subsequent increase in censorship of content. The images published on Twitter are incomplete portions of the document, and Jordan's tweets provide additional context, such as dates and sender of the email. He says he obtained the internal communications through a Judiciary Committee subpoena. And so I guess I would just like to add here that for almost all the documents that he posted, it doesn't include the sender of the email and other data which could help, and the full context of the email as well. He sends a clip, a little screenshot of a paragraph from an email. And so I don't think Representative Jim Jordan is manufacturing these and that these aren't legitimate emails. I doubt, but it may be slightly more likely that he is very much exaggerating what these emails show. But I really don't think that's the case either. And we'll get into, what we read here that seems pretty conclusive. But just know that these are not like WikiLeaks files that we got where it has, the entire document. And Jim Jordan isn't Matt Taibbi, where if he were to put together a Twitter thread like this, at least for me, it would carry a lot more credibility. So I just wanted to kind of make those notes before we get into it, because I do think this is significant, and particularly to me. So in April of 2021, the White House demanded Facebook remove a meme that said, quote, 10 years from now, you will be watching the TV in here. Did you or a loved one take the COVID vaccine? You may be entitled to. And, this is certainly a joke from something I recognize a lot from my childhood, where you have a meme, or not a meme, a TV ad, that's on during whatever show you're watching. And the announcer comes up, and it's usually a guy with a deeper voice, and he says, did you or a loved one do X, Y, or Z, travel here, live here, use this particular project, and then they'll say, call because you may be entitled to some kind of compensation because, the company did something wrong. So the meme is the featured image on the article I wrote. So if anybody wants to read the article, you could see it. I also have it up here for anybody watching. You see the meme right here. All right, so Nick Clegg, Facebook's president for global affairs, wrote an email that Andy Slavitt, the then White House senior advisor for the COVID response, was, quote, outraged. And this is a quote that Clegg wrote. Outraged, not too strong of a word to describe his reaction. That's Andy Slavitt's reaction, that Facebook did not remove the meme. He additionally said Slavitt expressed there was a consensus at a conference he attended that Facebook was a, quote, disinformation factory. Klug reported he argued that removing content like that would represent a significant incursion into the traditional boundaries of free expression in the U.S. Slavitt, who is currently a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, working group on public health, countered, insisting that the meme inhibits confidence, and this is a quote, inhibits confidence in the COVID vaccine amongst the Biden administration, amongst those the Biden administration is attempting to reach. And so essentially what we have here is a Facebook employee saying that he talked to a White House administration employee, and that employee was, quote, outraged at Facebook and also called Facebook a disinformation factory, when the Facebook employee pushed back and said, look, this is traditionally something we consider free speech, free expression, American values. The White House employee said, look, the Biden administration is trying to reach certain people and get them the COVID vaccine, and you are getting in the way. So back to the article here. Other Facebook executives expressed concern about resisting the White House's demands. Facebook Vice President of Public Policy Brian Rice expressed Slavitt's quote, challenge felt very much like a crossroads for us within the Biden White House's early days. He added, given what's at stake here, it would also be a good idea if we could regroup and take stock of where we need in our relations with the White House and our internal methods too. So he's saying that it feels like the White House is kind of testing or challenging Facebook as the Biden administration was taking over first few months of the administration, April 2021, and that we should basically regroup and figure out what we need to do to get on a good footing with the White House. It appears as one example of Facebook attempting to improve its standing within the White House was by throttling a video published by then Fox News host Tucker Carlson. In the talking points drafted for Clegg, he is instructed to tell Savat that Facebook elected to give Carlson's video a 50% demotion for 7 days, despite the company reviewing the video and determining it does not violate those policies. And that's a quote. So they suppressed Tucker Carlson's video to get in good with the White House, even though Tucker didn't do anything wrong by Facebook's own admission. A document from August 2021 reveals Facebook felt pressure from the White House was mounting and the company was seeking other methods to increase censorship to appease the Biden administration. Facebook asked teams to find additional policy levers we could pull to be more aggressive against COVID and vaccine misinformation. This is stemming from the continued criticism of our approach from the Biden administration. As Facebook sought the administration's direction regarding content censorship, it appears both sides wanted to downplay the relationship and sought to develop, quote, discreet ways to suppress certain viewpoints on the platform. One option that Meta, Facebook's parent company, considered was to ban users across the platform. One example listed in the document was, quote, RFK's Jr. is banned on Instagram, so his Facebook page should be non-recommendable. Jordan introduced his Twitter thread as, quote, the Facebook files, and indicated he has more documents to publish showing further collusion between the White House and Facebook. The Facebook files is a spin on the Twitter files, a series of disclosures published by Matt Taibbi and other journalists who had access to Twitter's internal communications, showing the company's compliance with the U.S. government's demands for censoring content suppression. Now, at the beginning, I said I felt like this was relevant to me, and that's because I was banned from Facebook in late May of 21. And so given the timeline of when the censorship from the White House, really ramped up, I'm not necessarily saying that I was posting anything so hot that the White House personally said, look at this guy, we gotta, make sure that Facebook takes him down. But if the White House is saying that we need certain viewpoints suppressed, then to be honest, I'm not surprised that I got banned from Facebook, because very early on, myself and Will Porter on this show were, really talking about some of the first people to be talking about the Wuhan Institute for Virology and the possibility of a lab leak causing the COVID outbreak. Now, we weren't saying we know for sure this is happening. We're just saying, well, they're saying that this outbreak started within a couple miles from a place where they were doing experiments that were somewhat similar to something that could have caused COVID. This certainly seems suspicious and worth looking into. And, we end up getting banned from Facebook. So one has to, wonder if that had anything to do with it. For a long time, I actually had suspected that it was my coverage of the Israeli murder of Israeli or Palestinian American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was a veteran journalist and who had done tons of work in Gaza or in Palestine in general, and was murdered in Jenin, the West Bank city, as the Israeli forces were carrying out a raid. Absolutely no reason to kill her, but they did it anyways. And so I had long suspected that it was that had gotten me banned, because I was, going really hard and covering that a lot around the time I was banned. But now, given these emails, I do wonder if it was because me and Will were just so early and so good on all the COVID stuff, if that ended up coming back and getting us banned. Now, one more thing I should mention here is that I just went ahead and created a new Facebook account. They wouldn't let me have that, my old one, unfortunately. So I know there was a time where I was pretty active on Facebook and I engaged with a lot of people on Facebook. I'm not sure I'll ever get back to that level again of being that active on Facebook. However, if you are on Facebook, I will be posting. I will be hanging out over there from time to time. So if you ever have questions and you use Facebook more than Twitter, you're certainly willing to hit me up, free to hit me up there. Please add me on Facebook. If you listen to the show and our Facebook user, if we don't have any mutual friends, just send a message saying like, hey, Kyle, I like the show or something like that. That way I know that you're not a bot and a real person. All right. One more story here before we get into some Russian news. Blinken rejects Australia's calls to drop case against Julian Assange. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Saturday rejected Australian calls concerning WikiLeaks founder and Australian citizen Julian Assange, who faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. Blinken was in Australia with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to discuss bolstering military ties between the U.S. and Australia. At a press conference during the visit, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong said Canberra has made it clear to Washington that it wants the U.S. to drop the case against Julian Assange. She said, "We have made it clear in our view that Mr. Assange's case has dragged on for far too long, and our desire is that it be brought to a conclusion. And we have said publicly, and you would anticipate that reflects also on the position we articulate in private." Blinken confirmed that the issue has been discussed but rejected Australia's concerns. He said Australia must recognize the U.S.'s position on Assange, claiming the WikiLeaks founder alleged actions risk, quote, very serious harm to our national security, which is a outright and blatant lie. It is a unreal lie that Antony Blinken in 2023 is making this statement. It's absolutely disgusting. He went on to say Mr. Assange is charged with very serious criminal conduct in the United States in connection with his alleged role in one of the largest compromises of classified information in the history of our country. So Antony Blinken is upset that Julian Assange helped Chelsea Manning release documents that showed America was torturing people from all over the Middle East, showed the U.S. was committing war crimes in Afghanistan, showed the U.S. was committing war crimes in Iraq. It released also State Department cables that showed other U.S. malfeasance around the world. It's not that Julian Assange found, I don't know, Joe Biden's bank information and released that or anything that shouldn't be released. What he released was important information to helping Americans understand what their military, what their political leadership is doing in the world. All right, one more little quote here from Blinken. "So I say that only because we understand the sensitivities here. It's important that our friends understand sensitivities in the United States." Man, I wish I could use some of the words I have in mind for Blinken right now, but let's just keep going with Dave DeCamp's article here. Assange has been indicted under the Espionage Act by the U.S. Justice Department related to documents WikiLeaks published that it obtained from former Army Private Chelsea Manning. But Assange obtained the material using standard journalistic practices, and if he is convicted in the U.S., it would set a grave precedent for press freedom. And with that, we can remember during the Obama administration that his Justice Department determined that if the U.S. pursued charges against Julian Assange, it would be left with what it called a New York Times problem, and that's because Julian Assange doesn't do anything fundamentally different than what the New York Times does, and so if they put Assange in jail for that, then they could start jailing New York Times writers. Extremely concerning, the complete destruction of the First Amendment, and Blinken is in Australia going, well, we have sensitivities in the United States we need need to consider what a joke of a diplomat. And if we could remove him from that position, well, Victoria Nuland's the number 2 now, so it could get worse. I shouldn't say that, but having a real Secretary of State would be very helpful at a time like this, especially as we get into this next story. This from Dave DeCamp, July 27th, antiwar.com. Arms control experts criticize U.S. for not sending Russia proposal to curb nuclear weapons deployments. Arms control experts have criticized the Biden administration for failing to send a proposal to Russia on maintaining limits on nuclear weapons deployments that was publicly floated by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last month. Sullivan said on June 2nd that the U.S. was willing to open talks with Russia on a framework to preserve curbs on nuclear arms deployments after 2026, the final year of the New START Treaty, the last nuclear arms control agreement that exists between the two powers. While Russia has suspended its participation in New START, both sides say they will continue to comply with the treaty's limit. New START caps the deployment of nuclear warheads for both sides at 1,550 and also restricts the deployment of nuclear bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Sullivan said the U.S. was willing to open talks on the issue without preconditions, but last week, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said the Russians had not received any proposals from the U.S. on resuming arms control talks, and added Moscow has studied what Sullivan said publicly and said Russia was not interested in negotiations until the U.S. changes its hostile policies against Russia, referring to the war in Ukraine. Daryl Kimball, executive director of the Arms Control Association, told Reuters he believes Ryabkov's statement still leaves open the possibility for eventual negotiations. My interpretation is there is still scope for the United States to communicate about what they are interested in. Cabal said there is no excuse for the administration's delay for nearly 2 months in the formal communications of its proposal to the Kremlin. So again, lack of diplomacy creates a lot of problems for the U.S. and the world. All right, now some news more related to the war in Ukraine. Medvedev says Russia would use nukes if counteroffensive was successful. And this really gets into something that I've been talking about a lot on the show over the past couple of weeks. And that is the U.S. is having Ukraine carry out military maneuvers and telling Ukraine to launch a war that, if it was successful by Ukraine standards, would lead to a Russian nuclear response. And the White House knows this and doesn't actually want Ukraine to have that much success in Russia. They just want them to keep fighting. So Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, said Sunday that if Ukraine's struggling counteroffensive was successful, Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. By repelling the collective enemy's counteroffensive, our armed forces are defending Russia's civilization and our land. It's quite clear to all decent people. Besides that, we are preventing global conflict. Medvedev said that Ukraine's counteroffensive was successful. They took away a part of our land. Russia would have to use nuclear weapons. Now, he is, I think, overstating the situation as he has done throughout the war. I've said this in the past. I'm not sure if Medvedev is maybe the serious here, that he really hates the United States more than any other Russian official, and he, wants to go out and is essentially Russia's Lindsey Graham, who is going to, be somebody within the realm of power, who has some influence, who goes out and makes the boldest, most provocative statements. It's also possible that he understands that he is serving a role here, and that he is basically, getting scripts from the Kremlin and asked to make these extremely provocative statements, and not necessarily that the Kremlin wants those to represent what Moscow's official policy is, but I'm sure there's in some desire a need to placate Russia's more hawkish elements, and so doing that is probably throwing some red meat to those people. But also, I'm sure Russia feels that making those threats is necessary. And look, what he's saying is Russia would consider a major response if this became an issue. So, just a really important thing to note there. Next up here, Russia says one civilian injured in Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow. A civilian was wounded in Ukraine in a Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow early Sunday morning. So the person was injured in Moscow, not in Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry said 3 drones targeted the Russian capital. It said 1 was shot down and 2 were suppressed by electronic warfare capabilities and crashed into a building complex in Moscow's business district. The TASS report said that the wounded civilian was a security guard. The incident marks the 3rd Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow within a week. The Russian Defense Ministry said that it thwarted a drone attack targeting the capital on Friday, with no casualties reported. According to CNN, a spokeswoman for the Ukrainian Air Force said the purpose of the drone attacks on civilian areas of Moscow was to impact those who feel the war is distant. There is always something flying in Russia as well as Moscow now that the war is affecting those who were not concerned. No matter how Russian authorities would like to turn a blind eye to this by saying they have intercepted everything, something does hit. And I want to say, from the Ukrainian perspective, I get the reason that they are carrying out attacks on Moscow. I'm sure it's, some of the same thinking and feeling that the Houthis have when they carry out attacks on Saudi territory. Now, this isn't something that is going to end the war. It is probably something that's going to really upset Moscow and lead to some large-scale bombings in Ukraine. And here, I think it's particularly problematic, unlike with the Houthis, because it's pretty obvious that the U.S. is aiding Ukraine in carrying out these attacks. And so from the Russian perspective, it's not just Kiev that's attacking Moscow. Washington is carrying out attacks on Moscow too here. And that is really significant in a huge escalation. All right, next up here, Ukraine's parliament votes to extend martial law, push back elections. Ukraine's parliament on Thursday voted to extend martial law and general mobilization, a move that pushes back parliamentary elections that were scheduled for October. Zelensky has previously said elections can't happen until under martial law because it is prohibited under Ukraine's constitution. If we have martial law, we cannot have elections. The constitution prohibits any elections during martial law. If there's no martial law, then there will be. Martial law has been extended several times in Ukraine since it was declared by Zelensky on February 24th, 22, when Russia first invaded. It is expected to be extended as long as the war continues. Now, I think there are a couple things worth noting here. And not that the war hasn't significantly changed from when it was a time that this was mainly a Ukrainian civil war to now, but for Ukraine to say, oh, we couldn't hold elections before, or we could hold elections before when Crimea was annexed, the Donbass and Luhansk were in open opposition to Ukraine, versus now when, there's a lot more bombing of Ukrainian territory going on. So it's not just in the country's east right now. And of course, Ukraine has, I'm sure, resources that could go to elections that are other places and things like that going on. But Ukraine has been under a war for 9 years now. So the idea that it is unthinkably impossible to hold elections now when Zelensky got elected during a presidential vote that happened during wartime is kind of interesting. I think worth pointing out. And of course, the Zelensky apologists will say, oh, well, this is just the consequence of Russia's war. But again, I think this is something Americans should take note of as we just give so much support to Ukraine and, kind of say all of it is due to the fact that we have to defend democracies from autocracies. All right, this is a really interesting article. I wrote it for the Libertarian Institute on July 30th. Saudi Arabia to host Ukraine peace talks without Russia. Saudi officials have invited diplomats from 30 countries to attend talks on the Ukraine war in early August. While it's unclear which countries will send a representative to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia did not extend an invitation to Russia. Riyadh hopes officials from up to 30 countries, including the US, Ukraine, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, Chile, and Zambia, will attend the talks slated for August 5th and 6th. Western officials desire to use the negotiations to solidify international support for peace talks that are favorable to Ukraine. And I just want to run through a couple of the countries on the list. India, Brazil, Egypt, Mexico, and Zambia all kind of stand out to me for, I think important reasons here. And that is, these are countries that are either independent or have even offered to host more independent talks. So these would be talks where, unlike the talks in Saudi Arabia, unlike the talks they held in Denmark recently, these would be countries that are looking for an international solution that could really bring the war to an end, rather than the American view of what the solution needs to be. And what they're trying to do is coach these countries in taking a more favorable position towards Ukraine, rather than, something more realistic that Russia supports. And so Britain, South Africa, Poland, and the EU have all said they will attend the summit. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is expected to represent Washington. The talks will be held in the Saudi city of Jeddah and are similar to a round of negotiations that took place in Copenhagen in June. The purpose of that meeting was to endorse principles that would underpin any settlement put forward by the Ukrainians. The talks in Jeddah appear unlikely to advance Russia and Ukraine towards any peace agreement. Currently, Kiev maintains it must retake all Ukrainian territory that Russia controls. Meanwhile, the Kremlin asserts it has annexed about 20% of Ukraine, and any deal to extend the war must reflect that reality. Additionally, Washington is further complicating matters by pushing to prosecute Russian officials for war crimes at the International Criminal Court. Even though the U.S. is not a member of the ICC and has previously threatened to evade the court if Americans were prosecuted, Washington now plans to aid The Hague in punishing Russian officials. The Kremlin has expectedly denounced any effort to charge Russian officials with war crimes. All right. So, last story on Russia here today, from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Pentagon authorizes hazard pay for U.S. troops in Ukraine. The Pentagon has authorized additional hazard pay for U.S. troops in Ukraine, the Military Times reported on Thursday. The news highlights the small U.S. military presence in Ukraine, although it's unclear how many U.S. troops are there. According to Pentagon documents that were released on Discord, there were a total of 29 DoD personnel inside Ukraine as of March 2023. The number included 14 special operations soldiers. According to the document, there were also 97 NATO special operations soldiers in Ukraine at the time. It is unclear what NATO special operator forces are doing on the ground. Other U.S. personnel in Ukraine include Marine Security Guard security augmentation units, who are typically deployed for embassy security. There are also officials within the defense attaché and members of the Office of Defense Cooperation, which I guess would be people who, at least ostensibly, would be carrying out inspections of the U.S. weapons sent to Ukraine. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you haven't already, please head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a donation, help us meet our goal in our fundraiser. We appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.